Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we are going to be talking more about grammar. Just a reminder there's not actually a grammar section on the IELTS course specifically. However, in both the speaking and the writing sections, grammar is something that is graded, right? It's one of the, I think, 4 or 5 things that they are looking for. Part of it is making sure your grammar is correct, and also part of it is making sure that you're using the strongest, most appropriate grammar, right? Because your spelling and grammar, all of it could be completely correct, but if you're only using simple sentences and not using anything else, then that's a problem. That's not going to get you to the highest level where you want to be. And so that's why we're talking about grammar today. So today specifically is actually our last day of grammar, and we're going to be talking about parallel structure and passive voice. Now, parallel structure has to do with being correct and getting the grammar correct in the first place. Passive voice has to do with more appropriateness, right? It's correct to use active voice or passive voice. However, there are times when using passive voice makes more sense in the context that we're going for, and therefore is going to be a stronger choice for us that will get us more marks than using active voice. So let's talk about both. So, parallel structure is when you balance the grammatical structures of words, clauses, sentences, or phrases in your writing. So, for example, if we're using a gerund, we're going to want to, we're going to want to continue to use that same structure, right? We're going to want to use another gerund. Whereas if we're using an infinitive, which is a verb, right, in the form of a verb, we're going to want to use another, verb. We're going to want to be consistent. So, for example, I want to go to Canada and study at the University of Toronto. Well, that is correct, right? We're first using an infinitive of to go, and then we're using study, which is also a verb, right? Whereas it's incorrect to say, I want to go to Canada and studying at the University of Toronto. That's not right because studying is a gerund. And earlier we used a verb. So we need to be consistent, right? We want to be consistent and use the same thing, right? So here's an example where we must balance the two infinitives. We can't use a gerund when we should be using a verb, right? Whereas, let me just think of an example here where we use two gerunds, right? If I say I am going to Canada and studying at the University of Toronto, then that's correct, right? Because we use gerunds in both cases. So just making sure we're being consistent is important. Here's another example. Here, if we're using adverbs, we want to keep it adverbs, right? We could say he worked fervently and quickly, right? Both of these things are discussing how he worked, right? These are adverbs, words describing a verb. Whereas if we say he worked fervently and quick, well, people would honestly probably people would definitely still know what you meant. Okay, I will say that if you did say that in practice and in conversation, people would still understand what you meant. But this is technically not grammatical because quick is an adjective and not an adverb, right? And so it's stronger to say he worked fervently and quickly because quick is the is the adjective version of this word. We need to use the adverb version both times to balance them. Okay, here's an example with adjectives. We could say the balloon was round, big, and blue, right? If we say the balloon was round, blue, and it was not small, that has the same meaning, right? But the and it was not small thing, that's a clause that contained a verb, right? That's not balancing our adjectives, right? And so it's stronger to just say the balloon was round, big, and blue, right? Now, is it technically incorrect in this case to say and it was not small? Well, no, but those extra words don't really add any extra meaning or extra value, right? Because as much as we want to have longer, more complex sentences, we also want those sentences to have real meaning to them. We don't just want to put in a bunch of extra hooey, right? A bunch of extra words that don't really make sense there, right? So the first one makes more sense, it's stronger. Okay, then we have infinitive phrases. So here's an example. I could say, I can't decide whether to ride on the bus or to drive my car, right? I was consistent here. I used infinitives for both, right? Whereas if I say, I can't decide whether to ride on the bus or driving my car, well, that doesn't make sense because now we're mixing up infinitives with gerunds, right? To ride is an infinitive, driving is a gerund, right? Or the same thing with the third one. I can't decide whether riding on the bus or to drive my car, right? That doesn't make sense because, again, we're mixing gerunds with infinitives. But what we could use two gerunds, we could say, I can't decide whether I'll be riding on the bus or driving my car. That's okay, right? Because we used two gerunds there. We were consistent. So it's important to be consistent for both, right? Otherwise, our sentence is likely not going to be grammatical, or it might not be as strong. It might be more confusing and choppy to read instead of straightforward. Okay, here's an example with prepositional phrases, right? Here we have, in the first example, we have three prepositional phrases, right? Under the bridge, over the hill, and into the building, right? Three prepositional phrases there. Whereas here, for the second one, we have I walked under the bridge, over the hill, and the building, right? So in this case, we're not using a prepositional phrase, so it's unclear that we mean into the building, right? Did we walk over the building? Well, that might be what this suggests in a sense, but that doesn't make any sense. How do you walk over a building? I could see walking over a hill, but this clearly is not what the sentence is supposed to say, right? We are going to the building or into the building, right? Something like that would make a lot more sense, right? And so making sure we balance those prepositional phrases to be clear as to what we mean, because otherwise it sounds either like who knows what we're talking about, or it sounds like we're walking over a building, right? And that doesn't make sense, right? We're wondering, wait, is the and the building part of the over part, right? But no, that doesn't make any sense for someone to walk over a building. Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's talk now about active voice versus passive voice. So, active voice is when the subject is doing in the action of the verb. So, for example, I am eating a sandwich, right? I am going to the store. I am lighting a candle. I am going to bed, right? It's all about me. I'm the person, I'm doing an action. So, that's active voice. Now, passive voice is where the person or thing receiving the action is the subject rather than me. So either I as a subject am left out, or I am as the original subject become the object now, right? So the doer is no longer the subject. It's the receiver who's the subject. So for example, let's think of an example here. Instead of saying I ate some food, we could say food was eaten by me, or that food got eaten, for example, right? Because it's the new subject now is the receiver of the action, not the doer, right? It's not all about me doing things, it's about whoever received those things, right? So another the example here says Sally ate the hamburger, right? That's the active voice because Sally is the doer. She's the person doing the verb. She's eating that hamburger. Whereas an example of passive voice is when it says the hamburger was eaten by Sally, right? And so now the hamburger is the subject, but the hamburger didn't eat something. The hamburger is the receiver of the action, right? The hamburger received being eaten, right? The hamburger got eaten. So let's talk about structure and how we can actually make a sentence passive. So, first thing we do is we must move the object of the sentence and make it the subject. We also must add by before the new object, and then we must add the verb to be in a conjugated form to the front of the verb and change the verb to the past participle. So, for example, an active version is I ate lunch. Now, how can we step by step change I ate lunch to a passive form? Well, first things first, we need to move the object and make it the subject. So instead of I ate lunch, the first thing is going to be lunch, right? Lunch I ate, right, is what we're going to have. Then we need to add by before the new object, right? So the new object is, I, right? Now, I is a form of first person singular that we only use for subjects. We actually change I to me if we're using it in object form, right? So it's now going to be lunch ate me, right? Uh, but we want it to have the same meaning because lunch ate me does not make any sense. I ate lunch. Lunch did not eat me, right? So we have lunch ate me. We have to include by. So now we have lunch ate by me. And then last but not least, we need to change the verb instead of ate, right? Instead of lunch ate by me, we need to change ate to past participle, right? Which past participle of ate is eaten. And we also have to add the verb to be conjugated, right? The to be conjugated would be was, right? And the reason for that is because lunch is a singular thing, right? A lunch. And also we need to use past tense because ate was past it is past tense, right? I ate lunch means it's something I did in the past. Maybe I ate lunch yesterday or I ate lunch earlier today, or I'm talking about a lunch I ate 5 years ago. It doesn't matter. It's still something in the past. And so we still want to keep this the same meaning, right? When we're switching a sentence to passive, we're not actually changing the meaning of the sentence. We're just changing the form of the sentence, right? So I ate lunch and lunch was eaten by me. These are two sentences that mean the exact same thing when it comes down to it. But next, I want to talk about, well, if these are just two ways of writing the same thing, then why bother with passive voice? If active voice is easier for you, why wouldn't you just use active voice all the time? Because after all, it's correct. And while that's a good point, it is. I want to talk about when it would make more sense to use passive voice, as in when would it be stronger to use passive voice. And also, some of these examples are examples where we can't actually use active voice. So, for example, if we don't know who the doer was of the verb, right? For example, if someone stole my wallet, I probably wouldn't know who did it, right? I would probably say my wallet was stolen, but I wouldn't know, I might not know who did that. Or, oh, I woke up today and I saw that the cake was eaten by someone. Well, I don't know who did it. It was someone, but I don't actually know, right? So there's cases where it could make more sense to have the receiver as the subject instead of the doer. And here's the first one. The first one is if we're more interested in the receiver of the action than the doer. And this could depend on what we're talking about. Either active or passive for this case could make sense depending on the context of these sentences. The active form is the government charged taxpayers an extra 4% last year. The passive form is the taxpayers were charged an extra 4% by the government last year. Well, the question we have to ask ourselves to know which one of these is stronger to use is what are we talking about here specifically, right? Is this sentence part of an essay we're writing for our writing section that's about the government and what the government's doing? If so, active makes more sense, right? However, let's say that we're talking about the taxpayers and the things they have to face. Well, then probably passive would make more sense. And something that's important to note is it's not that it's wrong to use active in that case, or it's not that it's wrong to use passive in the other case. It just makes more sense and is a bit stronger if we use active when we're centering the government, the doer, in the conversation, and to use passive when we're centering the receiver of this action, right? The taxpayers who were charged this money, who received this action from the government, right? So that's one example. The second one is if the doer is obvious, right? So rather than saying the government charged taxpayers an extra 4% last year, if we say taxpayers were charged an extra 4% last year, well, who do we think did it, right? The government, of course. It's pretty obvious that the government did it. I don't think anyone else has the authority to charge taxpayers any amount of money in taxes, right? Other than the government. They are the only people who have the authority to do so, right? And so when I hear taxpayers were charged an extra 4% last year, I automatically assume that the people who charged them that extra money was the government, because who else would it be, right? I put a second example here that says the police arrested the murderer, right? I could put that in passive voice and say the murderer was arrested. In this case, I didn't mention the police, the doers. But the doers are obvious, right? Who else would have arrested a murderer or any kind of criminal, right? I don't think anyone other than the police really does that. Yeah, I don't think so. Not to my knowledge, right? And so therefore it's pretty obvious that probably it was a police officer who arrested this murderer. Okay. The other one is if the doer is irrelevant, right? So we could use active voice and say that the owner will close the store at 8 o'clock, or maybe it's the manager that will close the store at 8 o'clock, or the new employee will close the store at 8 o'clock. However, let's assume that we are a consumer and let's say it's 7:30 right now, which actually it is for me. But anyway, let's say it's 7:30 right now and I want to know if I have enough time to get to the store before it closes, right? So it's kind of irrelevant to me who the doer is. I don't really care who's closing the store. I do not care whatsoever if it's the owner or if it's the manager or if it's a new employee or if it's someone else. It doesn't matter to me, right? What matters is what time the store will be closed. But I don't really care who closes the store. I just care about the time. That's what's relevant to me. So it would make more sense to say the store will close at 9 o'clock. So I better hop to it if I want to get there on time, rather than making a point of discussing who will close the store. Now, again, in some contests, texts, active voice will make more sense. Maybe I'm a worker at the store and I'm thinking, oh, I know the store closed at 8 o'clock. Who's closing the store? If I ask that question, then active voice makes more sense because in that case, I want to know who's closing the store. Is it me? Is it the new employee? Is it the manager? Is it the owner? Who's going to do it? Because someone's got to close the store. Whereas to a customer who's wondering if they can get to the store before closing, they probably don't really care. It's not really relevant to their day who is closing this store. It just matters what time it's closing so they can get there on time or not, right? Okay. The next one is if we don't know who the doer was. So, for example, if we say our house was robbed, presumably we don't know who did it, right? If we knew who did it, we'd probably be saying so, right? Or my phone was stolen, right? Presumably I don't know who stole the phone in this situation, right? All right. So yeah, so those are some examples where it would make more sense to use passive voice than active voice. So I hope that was all helpful. And yeah, that is everything for the grammar section of all of this. Good work, everyone, and I will see you for the next module. Bye, everyone. Whew.